The foundation trench measured exactly 42 inches deep on the morning of April 14, 1887, and by noon, 3 separate neighbors had walked to the edge of the excavation site on the corner of what would become Elm and 2nd Street in Grafton, Dakota Territory, to tell Peder Halvorsen he was wasting his time. By sundown, the count had risen to 5, and the general consensus among the established residents of this modest settlement, population 340, so to give or take the transient railroad workers who drifted through every few weeks, was that the Norwegian immigrant with the strange accent and the stranger ideas about construction had lost whatever good sense the Atlantic crossing had left him. The temperature that day was a pleasant 51 degrees. The frost had been out of the ground for nearly 3 weeks, and every other man in Grafton who intended to build that spring was already laying sills directly on grade, or, at most, desetting them atop shallow stone footings no deeper than 18 inches. Peder Halvorsen, standing in his trench with a shovel worn smooth from 6 years of use, his boots caked in the heavy black clay of the Red River Valley, did not argue with any of them. He simply kept digging. What he was constructing, and what would take the better part of 4 months to complete, was not merely a house. It was an argument rendered in limestone, gravel, and compacted earth, on a quiet rebuttal to everything the residents of Grafton believed they understood about building on the northern prairie. And, like most arguments that matter, it would not be settled by words. It would be settled by a January night when the temperature dropped to 41 degrees below zero, and the earth itself became the enemy of every structure that sat upon it. Peder Halvorsen had arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1883, 4 years before the trench that would make his neighbors question his judgment. He was 31 years old, unmarried, and carried with him 2 things of consequence: a working knowledge of masonry construction learned from his father, who had built stone foundations for farmhouses in the Gudbrandsdalen Valley of central Norway for 37 years, and a deeply ingrained distrust of any building method that failed to account for what the ground does when water freezes inside it. In Norway, so this was not controversial knowledge. The Scandinavian building tradition had understood frost heave, the upward movement of soil caused by the expansion of freezing water, for centuries. Halvorsen's father had taught him that the bottom of any foundation must rest below the maximum depth to which frost penetrates the earth in a given location, because if it does not, the cyclical freezing and thawing of moisture beneath the footing will lift the structure unevenly, cracking walls, jamming doors, unsplitting floor joists, and eventually rendering the building uninhabitable. In Norway, where winter temperatures in the valleys regularly reached 20 below zero and frost could penetrate 30 to 36 inches into unprotected ground, this meant digging foundations to at least 40 inches. Halvorsen's father had always gone to 48 because, as he told his son repeatedly, the ground does not read your calculations and agree to cooperate. You give yourself margin, or you give yourself problems. This was the sum total of the radical, dangerous, laughable idea that Peder Halvorsen brought to Grafton, Dakota Territory. Dig deeper than the frost can reach, and the frost cannot move your house. That the residents of Grafton, many of whom had been building on the northern plains for 5, 8, even 12 years, considered this unnecessary, excessive, and evidence of immigrant foolishness, tells us something important about how knowledge travels. Or, on more precisely, how it doesn't. The objections were specific, practical, and, from the perspective of the men raising them, entirely reasonable. Grafton, in 1887, was not a settlement of ignorant people. It was a growing agricultural community with a functioning grain elevator, 2 general stores, a post office, a schoolhouse, and a weekly newspaper, the Grafton News and Times, which had been publishing since 1881. The men who came to observe Halvorsen's excavation were experienced builders by frontier standards. They had constructed homes that had survived multiple Dakota winters, and they had done so using methods that prioritized speed, economy, and the efficient use of scarce materials. Thomas Arden, who at 53 was among the oldest permanent residents, had built his own house in 1879 on a foundation of fieldstone set 12 inches into the ground. He had lived in it for 8 years, and while the northeast corner had settled slightly and the kitchen door stuck in February, he considered these minor inconveniences, not structural failures. Every house settles. Arden told Halverson on the second day of digging, standing at the edge of the trench with his arms folded across his chest. "You can dig to China if you want, but the ground moves and the house moves with it. Right, that is the nature of building on dirt." Arden's objection was philosophical. He believed that all foundations were, to some degree, temporary arrangements between a structure and the earth, and that the sensible approach was to build quickly, repair as needed, and accept imperfection as the cost of shelter. James Calloway, who was 38 and operated the lumber yard on the north end of town, had a different concern. Calloway's objection was economic, but he had watched Halverson spend 2 full days excavating a trench that measured 36 feet by 24 feet by 42 inches deep, removing approximately 93 cubic yards of heavy clay soil by hand, and he calculated that this labor alone represented at least $40 in equivalent wages, $40 spent before a single stone was laid, a single board cut, or a single nail driven. "I can put a man in a house in 6 weeks for $200 total," Calloway said, or leaning on the split rail fence that bordered the lot. "You're going to spend that just getting out of the ground." He was not entirely wrong about the cost. He was entirely wrong about the value. The third notable skeptic was Margaret Ustad, a widow of 46 who ran a boarding house on the west side of town and who had the distinction of having survived every Dakota winter since 1878 without losing a building. Mrs. Ustad's objection was experiential, and it carried weight because she had earned it. She had watched houses go up and houses come down. She had seen sod structures collapse under snow load, frame buildings twist off their footings in spring thaw, and one notable stone house on the Fargo Road crack almost perfectly in half during the winter of 1884 to 85. But she had also seen plenty of buildings on shallow foundations endure winter after winter with nothing worse than sticky doors and minor settling. "Mu, I do not doubt your father knew his business in Norway," she told Halverson one afternoon in May when the trench was complete and he had begun laying the first course of limestone. "But this is not Norway. The soil is different. The wind is different. And men who have been here longer than you have managed well enough without digging graves for their houses." Halverson listened to Margaret Ustad more carefully than he listened to the others, because she was observant, as because she had genuine experience and because she was almost right. The soil was different, the wind was different, but the physics of water freezing inside soil pores and expanding with a force of approximately 50,000 pounds per square foot, that was identical in Norway, in Dakota Territory, and on the surface of the moon if the moon had water and soil. Frost heave does not care about geography. It cares about 3 things: the presence of water, the presence of frost-susceptible soil, and a freezing front that penetrates to the depth where water and soil meet. Grafton, Dakota Territory. Sitting on heavy clay soil in a river valley with a water table that in spring rose to within 14 inches of the surface, and subject to winters where temperatures routinely fell below -20 degrees for weeks at a time, was not merely susceptible to frost heave. It was a laboratory designed to demonstrate it. The maximum frost penetration depth in the Red River Valley of Dakota Territory, as would eventually be documented by the U.S. Weather Bureau and later the Army Corps of Engineers, ranged from 36 to 48 inches, depending on snow cover, soil moisture content, and the duration of extreme cold. Every foundation in Grafton that sat above 36 inches was, in the language Halverson's father would have used, a bet against the ground. And the ground, and as Peder Halverson understood with the certainty of a man raised by a mason, does not lose bets. The construction that followed the excavation was methodical, precise, and exhaustively documented in Halverson's own notebooks. 3 leather-bound volumes written in a mixture of Norwegian and English that survived intact until they were donated to the University of North Dakota's Special Collections in 1964 by his granddaughter, Ellen Halverson Burke. And the notebooks reveal a mind that thought in measurements and contingencies. The foundation walls were constructed of locally quarried limestone, sourced from a deposit 11 miles northwest of Grafton near the settlement of Ardoch, cut to roughly uniform blocks averaging 8 inches by 12 inches by 16 inches, and laid in courses with a mortar composed of lime, sand, and a small proportion of Portland cement that Halverson had ordered from a supplier in St. Paul at a cost of $4.20 per barrel, a significant expense that required him to forego purchasing a new plow that spring. The walls were 18 inches thick at the base, tapering to 12 inches at the top course, and rose from the bottom of the 42-inch trench to 8 inches above the finished grade, giving a total foundation wall height of 50 inches. The exterior face of the wall, from grade to the bottom of the trench, and was coated with a mixture of hot pine tar and animal tallow, a waterproofing technique Halvorson's father had used in Norway to prevent moisture from migrating through the stone and into the cellar space. The interior of the foundation was backfilled with 12 inches of river gravel, hauled by wagon from a bar on the Park River 4 miles east of town, which served a purpose that none of Halvorson's critics understood and that he did not bother to explain. Drainage. So the gravel created a layer through which any water that penetrated the foundation walls or rose from the water table could move freely to a low point, rather than pooling against the stone and freezing in place. Beneath the gravel, Halvorson had laid a bed of coarse sand 6 inches deep, which served as a capillary break, a layer through which water could not wick upward by surface tension. The combined effect of these layers, sand, gravel, stone, artere, was a foundation system that managed water at every stage of its journey. It prevented water from rising through the soil into the foundation space. It prevented water from penetrating the walls laterally, and it provided drainage for any water that did enter the system through condensation or minor seepage. This was not guesswork. This was a system refined by generations of Scandinavian builders working in climates where water and frost were the primary destroyers of structures, and Halvorson executed it with the quiet confidence of a man applying proven knowledge to a new location. The total cost of the foundation, including materials and the equivalent value of his labor, calculated at $1.25 per day, came to $114, nearly twice what James Callaway had predicted and fully 60% of Callaway's estimate for an entire house. If you value the preservation of practical knowledge like this, wisdom that was once common and has since been largely forgotten, I would ask you to consider subscribing to this channel, because these stories exist in aging notebooks and crumbling newspaper archives, and every year more of them disappear. A subscription costs nothing and ensures that when we find these accounts, we can bring them to you before they're lost entirely. The house that rose above this foundation was, by contrast, unremarkable. It was a simple frame structure, 28 feet by 18 feet on the interior, with walls of milled lumber sheathed in clapboard, a gabled roof with cedar shingles, 2 rooms on the ground floor divided by a central chimney, and a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. The framing lumber came from Callaway's yard. Halvorson bore no grudges against skeptics and bought from the most convenient source, and was standard dimension stock: 4x4 sills, 2x6 studs at 24-inch centers, 2x8 rafters. The chimney was brick, laid by Halvorson himself, with a firebox designed to the specifications of Count Rumford's published dimensions, which Halvorson had encountered in a translated pamphlet his father owned. A shallow firebox, angled sides, and a narrow throat that directed heat into the room rather than up the flue. The entire structure, foundation to ridge, was completed by August 22nd, 1887, a construction period of 4 months and 8 days, during which Halvorson also worked his 80-acre claim 3 miles south of town, planting 32 acres of spring wheat and 12 of oats. The house was not beautiful. It was not large, but it sat on a foundation that went 42 inches into the earth, rested on undisturbed clay below the frost line, was waterproofed on all exterior surfaces, drained internally through gravel and sand, and was, by every measure that mattered, the most structurally sound residential foundation in Walsh County, Dakota Territory. The first test came in November. It was not a dramatic test. November in the Red River Valley rarely is, despite what people who have never lived there might imagine. The temperature dropped below freezing on October 29th and did not rise above 32 degrees again until the following April, a continuous period of cold that would span 163 days. But November's cold was moderate by Dakota standards. Overnight lows in the single digits, daytime highs in the teens and low 20s, the ground freezing steadily downward at a rate of roughly half an inch per day through the bare, wind-scoured clay. By the end of November, frost had penetrated approximately 16 inches into the unprotected soil around Grafton, well below the bottom of Thomas Arden's 12-inch foundation, so you're beginning to approach the depth of the 18-inch footings used by several other residents, and not yet halfway to the bottom of Halverson's 42-inch trench. The effects were subtle at first, and this subtlety was itself part of the problem. Frost heave does not announce itself with dramatic cracking or sudden displacement. It works slowly, incrementally, with the patient destructiveness of water becoming ice and expanding by approximately 9% of its volume, and pushing soil grains apart, lifting whatever sits above it by fractions of an inch, then releasing its grip during brief thaws, only to seize again when the cold returns. Over the course of a single winter, a foundation sitting above the frost line might rise and fall a dozen times, each cycle slightly different from the last, each displacement slightly uneven because the soil beneath the foundation is never uniformly wet, never uniformly dense, never uniformly exposed to cold. The northeast corner might heave 3/4 of an inch, while the southwest corner heaves only a 1/4 inch. And this differential movement, this unequal lifting, is what cracks walls, binds doors, splits floor joists, and eventually tears buildings apart from below. Thomas Arden noticed his kitchen door sticking more than usual by late November. He attributed it to the wood swelling in cold weather, which was partially correct. But the primary cause was that the northeast corner of his house had already risen approximately 1/2 an inch relative to the southwest corner, tilting the door frame just enough to bind the door against the jamb. James Calloway's own house, built in 1882 on a foundation of cedar posts set 20 inches into the ground, showed no obvious distress in November. But Calloway had not crawled beneath his floor to observe that a hairline crack had appeared in the center beam where it crossed the midpoint of the structure, a crack caused not by overloading, but by the slight upward bowing of the beam as the posts beneath it responded to differential frost forces. Margaret Austad's boarding house, which sat on a continuous stone footing 18 inches deep, performed better than either Arden's or Calloway's, because the continuous footing distributed heave forces more evenly, but even her building showed the first signs of seasonal movement. A gap had opened between the baseboard and the floor in the front parlor, barely wide enough to admit a knife blade, but there, measurable. A record written in wood and stone of the ground's slow assertion of authority over everything built upon it. Halverson's house, 42 inches below grade, showed nothing. The doors swung freely. The floor was level. The baseboards sat tight against the floorboards. The windows, which he had set with particular care in frames shimmed to exact plumb and level, opened and closed without resistance. This was not luck. This was not because his house was newer or lighter or built of better materials. This was because the bottom of his foundation sat 6 inches below the current frost line and would remain below it for the entire winter. The soil beneath his footings was unfrozen, stable, and undisturbed, and his house was not moving because the ground beneath it was not moving. This is how physics works. It does not care about your experience, your opinions, or how many winters you have survived. It cares about where the frost line is and whether your foundation is above it or below it. Halverson's was below it, everyone else's was above it. The consequences of this difference would become unmistakable by January. December brought the cold in earnest. The mean temperature for December 1887 in the Grafton area, as recorded by the voluntary weather observer at the Grafton Post Office, a man named Willard Crosby, who kept meticulous daily records in a ledger that now resides in the State Historical Society of North Dakota, was 4 degrees above zero. The coldest night was December 23rd, when the mercury fell to 26 below. By Christmas Day, frost penetration in exposed ground had reached approximately 28 inches, well past Arden's 12-inch footing, past Calloway's 20-inch posts, approaching the bottom of Margaret Austad's 18-inch stone wall, and still 16 inches above the bottom of Halverson's foundation. The effects were becoming harder to ignore. Arden's kitchen door now required lifting and shoving to open, and a crack had appeared in the plaster above the window in his north-facing bedroom, running diagonally from the upper corner of the frame toward the ceiling, the classic signature of differential foundation movement, a crack that follows the path of least resistance through the wall assembly as one corner of the structure rises relative to the other. Arden patched it with a mixture of lime and horsehair on December 27th. It reopened on December 30th. 2 houses down from Arden, A newer structure built in 1885 by a homesteader named Karl Brandt had developed a noticeable slope in the kitchen floor, noticeable enough that a marble placed on the floor rolled steadily from the south wall to the north wall, covering the 11-foot distance in approximately 8 seconds. Brandt's foundation was fieldstone on grade, meaning the stone sat directly on the surface of the ground with no excavation at all, and the frost heave beneath it was unrestricted and severe. The north wall of his house had risen approximately 1 3/4 inches relative to the south wall, and the floor joists, which were simply tacked to the sill with toenailed spikes rather than properly notched and pegged, were beginning to separate from the sill on the south side, opening gaps through which cold air entered the living space in thin, persistent streams that no amount of rags or newspaper stuffed into the cracks could fully stop. Brandt's family, his wife Anna, and their 2 sons aged 7 and 4, and Anna's mother, who was 61 and in declining health, burned through their firewood at a rate that alarmed even Brandt, who had laid in what he considered a generous supply of 8 cords in October. By Christmas, 4.5 cords were gone, consumed not by comfortable living, but by the desperate attempt to maintain survivable temperatures in a house that was slowly tearing itself apart from below, opening new pathways for cold air with every inch of differential heave. If this story is resonating with you, if you find value in understanding how the decisions people made 140 years ago carry lessons we've largely forgotten, I'd be grateful if you'd hit the like button. It's a small action, but it tells the algorithm that this kind of content matters, and it helps us reach others who care about preserving practical knowledge before it vanishes entirely. Meanwhile, Peder Halvorsson's house sat quiet and plumb on its 42-inch foundation, burning approximately 3/4 cord of wood per week, a rate that reflected not only the Rumford fireplace's superior efficiency, but also the absence of infiltration cracks caused by structural movement. His floors were level, his doors swung true, his windows sealed against their frames, and the gap between his experience and his neighbor's experience was about to widen dramatically. About because January 1888 was coming, and January 1888 would be remembered across the northern Great Plains for generations. The storm that would later be called the School Children's Blizzard struck on January 12, 1888, and while its most devastating effects were felt in Nebraska, where dozens of children died attempting to walk home from schoolhouses in whiteout conditions, the Northern Dakota Territory experienced its own version of the event as part of a broader pattern of extreme cold that settled over the region in the first 3 weeks of January. The temperature in Grafton, according to Willard Crosby's records, fell to 34 below zero on the morning of January 13th, rose to -19 during the brief midday hours, and dropped again to 37 below by midnight. So wind speeds were estimated at 35 to 40 miles per hour from the northwest, producing wind chill values that modern calculations would place somewhere around -70 degrees, temperatures at which exposed flesh freezes in under 2 minutes and kerosene becomes sluggish in its lamps. But the wind, chill, brutal as it was a threat to people caught outside. The deeper threat, the one that operated below the surface, uninvisible and inexorable, was what the sustained cold was doing to the ground itself. By January 13th, frost penetration in exposed soil around Grafton had reached approximately 36 inches. At 36 inches, the frost line had reached the bottom of every residential foundation in town except one. The consequences were immediate, violent, and, for one family, fatal in their secondary effects. Thomas Arden's house, which had been showing progressive signs of distress since November, had experienced what can only be described as a structural failure during the night of January 13th. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, the northeast corner of the building, the corner that had been rising steadily all winter, heaved sharply as a lens of ice formed in the saturated clay beneath the shallow footing, and the sill on that side rose approximately 3 inches in the space of several hours. The floor joists, which were notched into the sill, pulled upward with it, and the floorboards on the north side of the house separated at their tongue and groove joints, opening gaps of 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch along the entire north half of the building. Cold air flooded through these gaps with the relentless pressure of a 37 below wind finding every opening, and the temperature inside Arden's house, which had been maintained at a tolerable 45 degrees through continuous feeding of the stove, when dropped to 28 degrees within 90 minutes. Arden, who was 53 and suffered from the chronic joint pain that afflicted most men who had spent decades doing physical labor in extreme climates, spent the remainder of the night and all of the following day attempting to seal the floor gaps with rags, newspapers, and strips of canvas cut from a wagon cover, while simultaneously feeding his stove at a rate that consumed an entire cord of wood in 31 hours. He survived, but the experience left him weakened, and he would later tell Margaret Oostad, who recorded the conversation in a letter to her sister in Minneapolis, dated February 3, 1888, that the night of January 13th was the first time in 8 years of Dakota living that he genuinely believed he might die in his own house. Carl Brandt's situation was worse. His house, on its grade-level stone foundation, had been deteriorating all winter, so when the extreme cold of mid-January accelerated the process catastrophically. By January 14th, the floor on the north side of his house had separated from the sill entirely, opening a continuous gap of nearly 2 inches along the base of the north wall. The floor itself had buckled upward in the center of the house, as opposing heave forces pushed from both sides, while creating a ridge approximately 4 inches high that ran the width of the building and made walking across the room a matter of climbing over an obstacle. The stove, which sat on a stone pad near the center of the room, tilted as the floor beneath the pad heaved unevenly and the stovepipe separated from the chimney thimble, filling the house with smoke and forcing Brandt to open the door to ventilate, admitting a blast of 37 below air that dropped the interior temperature to well below zero in minutes. Brandt's mother-in-law, Ingrid Dahl, who was 61 and had been ill with a respiratory ailment since before Christmas, was moved to Margaret Oostad's boarding house on the afternoon of January 14th, so carried on a makeshift litter by Brandt and 2 neighbors through wind-driven snow in -30 conditions, a distance of approximately 400 yards that took nearly 20 minutes to cover. She died on January 19th. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Howard Mallory of Grafton, listed the cause as pneumonia, and this was accurate as far as it went. But the chain of causation that led to Ingrid Dahl's death began not with a bacterium, but with a foundation that sat on the surface of ground that froze 42 inches deep, and a house that could not withstand the forces that freezing generated. Peder Halvorson's house, on the night of January 13th, 1888, maintained an interior temperature of 54 degrees. This was not warm by any modern standard, and Halvorson himself, in a notebook entry dated January 14th, noted that he had slept in his coat and considered the night cold but not dangerous. He burned approximately the same amount of wood he had been burning all winter, about 3/4 of a cord per week, because his house had no new infiltration points, no separating floor joints, no gaps between sill and foundation. His floors were level. His doors opened and closed without resistance. His stovepipe remained firmly seated in its thimble. Yet the frost line on that night reached an estimated 38 inches below the surface of the exposed ground. The bottom of Halvorson's foundation was at 42 inches. 4 inches of unfrozen soil separated his footing from the freezing front, and those 4 inches were the margin between the structural integrity he enjoyed and the structural failure his neighbors endured. 4 inches. Approximately the width of a man's hand. His father, who had always gone to 48 inches when 40 was probably sufficient, would have said, "You give yourself margin or you give yourself problems." And on the night of January 13th, 1888, with the temperature at 37 below and the wind tearing across the Dakota Prairie at 35 miles an hour, Peder Halvorson's 6 inches of margin, his foundation was 42 inches against a frost line of 38, proved the difference between a house that stood firm and houses that were tearing themselves apart around their occupants. That is not luck. That is not even engineering in the formal sense. That is a man who understood what the ground does in winter and built accordingly, and then watched while the winter proved him right. The mathematics were not complicated. They were, in fact, simple enough that a child could understand them. Dig below where the frost goes, and the frost cannot lift your house. Do not dig below where the frost goes, and the frost will lift your house unevenly, repeatedly, destructively, with a force that no amount of craftsmanship above grade can resist. 50,000 pounds per square foot. That is the expansive force of water freezing in saturated clay. No sill, no joist, no nail, or no amount of pioneer determination can hold against 50,000 pounds per square foot. Only depth can hold against it. Only being below it can defeat it. Peder Halvorsen was below it. Everyone else was in it. The aftermath unfolded through the remainder of that winter and into the spring thaw, and it followed a pattern that anyone who has studied the adoption of practical innovations on the frontier would recognize immediately. The pattern is this: crisis reveals the truth, and the truth travels on foot, one conversation at a time, carried not by the innovator but by the people who suffered. Halvorsen did not go door to door explaining frost heave or advocating for deep foundations. He did not write letters to the Grafton News and Times or give speeches at the general store. He continued to live in his house, tend his claim, and mind his own affairs with the characteristic reserve of a man who had been raised to believe that competence speaks for itself and that unsolicited advice is a form of rudeness. The advocacy came instead from the people whose houses had failed them. Thomas Arden was the first. In late February, when a brief thaw allowed travel, and before the next round of cold set in, Arden walked to Halvorsen's house, a distance of approximately 3/4 of a mile, and asked to see the foundation. Now Halvorsen took him to the cellar access, a hatch door on the south side of the house that opened onto a short flight of stone steps descending to the gravel floor of the foundation space. Arden spent nearly 30 minutes examining the walls, the gravel drainage layer, the tar waterproofing visible on the interior face where a small section of stone had been left uncoated as a reference point, and the floor joists overhead, on which sat tight and level on their sills without a single visible crack or separation. He said very little during this inspection, but when he emerged, he stood in the snow beside the house and looked at the structure for a long time, and then he said something that Halvorsen recorded in his notebook that evening, in English, with quotation marks indicating a direct quote. "I have been building wrong for 8 years and calling it experience." This was not a casual admission, and for a man of Arden's age and standing in the community, a man who had survived 8 Dakota winters and considered himself knowledgeable about construction, to acknowledge that his entire approach to foundation work was fundamentally flawed required a degree of intellectual honesty that should not be underestimated. Arden went home and, over the following weeks, told anyone who would listen what he had seen under Halvorsen's house and what he had failed to see: movement, cracks, gaps, see any evidence whatsoever of the frost damage that had buckled floors and cracked walls across the rest of Grafton. Margaret Austad was the second convert, and her conversion was characteristically practical. She did not visit Halvorsen's foundation. She did not need to. She had watched her boarding house develop new cracks every winter for 9 years, had spent money and labor every spring on repairs that she now understood were treating symptoms rather than causes, and she had just housed a dying woman whose death was, in Mrs. Ustad's clear-eyed assessment, directly attributable to a house that could not protect its occupants because its foundation was too shallow to resist the ground it sat on. In March 1888, Mrs. Ustad hired Halvorsen, paying him $2 per day plus meals, which was generous for the time and place, to excavate and construct a new foundation beneath her boarding house, on a project that required lifting the entire structure on timber cribbing, excavating the existing 18-inch footing, digging to 44 inches, and laying a new limestone foundation to Halvorsen's specifications, including the gravel drainage, sand capillary break, and tar waterproofing. The project took 6 weeks and cost Mrs. Ustad $141, which she later described as the best money she had ever spent. So if you find yourself returning to this channel for these stories, if they've become part of how you think about building, or history, or the way practical wisdom gets lost and found, I'd ask you to share this video with someone who might feel the same way. These accounts survive in fragments, and the more people who know about them, the more likely it is that someone will recognize a name, a place, or a detail that leads us to the next story worth telling. So James Calloway's response was different, and in its way, equally telling. Calloway did not visit Halvorsen's house, did not ask to see the foundation, and did not publicly acknowledge that his own approach to construction had been inadequate. What he did, beginning in the spring of 1888, was quietly begin recommending to his lumberyard customers that they excavate their foundations to a minimum of 36 inches, not the 42 that Halvorsen used, but deep enough to reach below the frost line in all but the most extreme winters. He did not credit Halvorsen for this recommendation. He presented it as his own professional judgment, derived from his own observations. Halvorsen, when he learned of this through mutual acquaintances, said nothing. This is how knowledge spreads on the frontier, not through attribution or academic citation, but through adoption. The test of an idea is not whether the person who first applied it receives credit. The test is whether the idea survives and spreads because it works. By this measure, Halvorsen's idea passed its test completely. By 1892, 5 years after Halvorsen dug his 42-inch trench, deep foundations had become standard practice in Grafton and throughout much of the northern Red River Valley. A survey of building permits issued by Walsh County between 1890 and 1895, records that survive in fragmentary form in the county courthouse in Grafton, shows that of 23 residential structures permitted during that period, 19 specified foundation depths of 36 inches or greater. The 4 exceptions were all agricultural outbuildings, granaries and equipment sheds, where some seasonal movement was considered acceptable, and no residential foundation permitted after 1891 was less than 36 inches deep. The practice spread beyond Grafton through the networks of commerce, family, and shared hardship that connected frontier communities. Settlers who had experienced the winters of 1887 to 88 and 1888 to 89 carried the lesson with them when they moved, advised relatives arriving from the East or from Scandinavia, and mentioned it in letters that circulated among extended families considering emigration. By the mid-1890s, our deep foundations were common practice throughout the northern tier of Dakota Territory, which had become the states of North and South Dakota in 1889, and the practice was reinforced by the growing availability of published building guides that specified minimum foundation depths based on regional frost penetration data. The 1895 edition of Kidder's Building Construction and Superintendents, which was widely used as a reference by builders and architects throughout the Upper Midwest, should included a table of recommended foundation depths that specified 42 inches for the northern Great Plains, the exact depth Peder Halvorsen had used 8 years earlier, based not on any published table, but on the practical knowledge his father had carried from Norway. It is worth pausing to note what happened to the physical evidence of this story. Halvorsen's house stood on its original foundation until 1943, when it was demolished to make way for a commercial building, a hardware store that, with considerable irony, was itself built on a concrete foundation poured to a depth of 42 inches, the same depth Halvorsen had used 56 years earlier, now mandated by building code rather than individual judgment. The limestone foundation blocks were used as fill material and are presumably still buried somewhere beneath the parking lot that currently occupies the site. Halvorsen's notebooks survived because his daughter, Karen Halvorsen Lund, understood their value and preserved them, eventually passing them to Karen's daughter Ellen, who donated them to the university. The Grafton News and Times published no article about Halvorsen's foundation, his construction methods, or the differential performance of deep versus shallow foundations during the winter of 1887 to 88. The death of Ingrid Dahl was noted in the newspaper's regular column of community events with a single sentence. Mrs. Ingrid Dahl, mother-in-law of Mr. Carl Brandt, died January 19th of pneumonia. She was 61 years of age. No mention of the house that failed, the foundation that heaved, the floor that buckled, the stovepipe that separated, the smoke and cold that drove a sick woman out into 30 below temperatures. No mention of the chain of cause and effect that connected a 12-inch footing to a coffin. And no mention of the house 3/4 of a mile away where a Norwegian immigrant's 42-inch foundation kept the floors level, the doors true, and the stovepipe seated through the worst winter the territory had yet experienced. Peder Halvorsen died on March 7, 1921, at the age of 69. His obituary in the Grafton News and Times, which by then had merged with another local paper and was publishing under a slightly different name, ran to 9 lines. It mentioned that he had been a farmer, a member of the Lutheran Church, a resident of the Grafton area for 38 years, and that he was survived by his wife, Sigrid, his daughter Karen, and 4 grandchildren. It did not mention foundations, frost heave, drainage gravel, pine tar waterproofing, or the fact that his approach to building on frozen ground had, within a decade of its demonstration, become the standard practice for an entire region, and within a generation, a codified requirement of every building code in the northern United States. This is what happens to innovations that succeed completely. They become invisible. The deep foundation is now so universally standard in cold climates that no one thinks to ask where the practice came from, knew who first applied it in a given region, or what happened to the people who built shallow. The 2021 International Residential Code specifies minimum foundation depths based on frost line data for every county in the United States. In Walsh County, North Dakota, Grafton's county, the minimum specified depth is 42 inches. The number has not changed since Peder Halvorsen first drove his shovel into the black clay on April 14, 1887. The modern discipline of frost-protected foundation design, which now encompasses not only depth requirements, but also the use of rigid insulation to modify frost penetration patterns around shallow foundations, a technique that allows builders in extreme climates to use shallower footings by preventing frost from reaching beneath them, owes its fundamental principle to the same understanding that Halvorsen's father taught him in Norway: know where the frost goes and build below it, or protect against it, or accept the consequences. Why, the principle has not changed. The materials have changed: concrete instead of limestone, rigid polystyrene instead of pine tar, engineered drainage systems instead of river gravel, but the physics remain identical. Water freezes, ice expands, soil heaves, foundations move, structures fail. The solution in 2024 is the same as it was in 1887. Get below the frost, or get the frost away from your foundation. There is no third option. The ground does not negotiate. This is what Peder Halvorsen knew. What his father knew before him, what the building codes now mandate, and what the residents of Grafton, Dakota Territory learned in the winter of 1887 to 88 at a cost measured not only in cracked walls and buckled floors, but in the life of a 61-year-old woman who died because the house she sheltered in was built on a foundation that pretended the frost line did not exist. The frost line exists. It existed in Norway. It existed in Dakota Territory. It exists beneath your house right now. But if you live north of the 40th parallel, descending steadily through the soil as winter deepens, testing every foundation it reaches, passing judgment on every builder's decision about how deep to dig. Halvorsen's trench was 42 inches deep. It was exactly deep enough. His neighbor's foundations were 12, 18, 20 inches deep. They were not deep enough. The difference was not a matter of opinion, tradition, experience, or craftsmanship. The difference was a matter of physics. Yes, and physics, as Halvorsen understood, and as his neighbors learned, does not grade on a curve. The trench they laughed at in April kept his floors perfect through January. The foundations they were so confident about cracked, heaved, buckled, and, in one case, contributed to conditions that killed a woman. That is not a story about Norwegian stubbornness or frontier pride. That is a story about the ground and what it does when you do not respect it, and what it does not do when you go deep enough to earn its indifference. Peder Halvorsen earned the ground's indifference. He dug 42 inches to get it, and that, in the end, was all that mattered.